Welcome to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to continue my series on the way Jesus sounds in John. All of this is dealt with in my book, The Eye of the Beholder, but I'm trying to make this material available in an audio and video form as well. Today I'm going to be talking about what I call the myth of the monologuing Jesus. So we've had a number of myths, the myth of the 7 I am discourses, the myth of the allegorical Jesus, the myth of the sack puppet Jesus. Today we're talking about the myth of the monologuing Jesus in John. What I mean by this is that scholars will imply that there is something suspicious, as far as robust historicity is concerned, about Jesus' discourses in John because they're so long. Okay? And it's interesting, sometimes you'll see implications like this without a very clear indication of exactly what is in view. Exactly what does the scholar propose and what would it look like as an explanation of this supposed phenomenon of the long discourses in John, which are different from the synoptics, allegedly. You find that kind of unclarity in several references that Dr. Craig Keener makes. I myself suspect that Dr. Keener does not think that John elaborated as much as Craig Evans thinks that John elaborated, but it's not clear how much Dr. Keener thinks that John did elaborate. So even in his recent book, Christobiography, he refers apparently approvingly to the idea that the discourses in John contain homiletic elaboration that was supposedly guided by the Holy Spirit. So, some kind of elaboration where John is making it longer and putting something or other into Jesus' mouth that is a teaching and an elaboration that John thinks was meant by Jesus' teaching, but he knows Jesus didn't historically say, but we're not sure. And perhaps Dr. Keener is not entirely sure how far he would go with that. But you'll see this reference to the long Johannine discourses in a lot of places. Dr. Evans is very emphatic about it. You can see it in the quotations that I've linked before, these long speeches in John. Jesus goes on and on for many verses and so forth. And that's supposed to cast some kind of doubt on this. And of course, as you know from past videos, Dr. Evans then combines this with this idea that Jesus looks like a allegorical figure, Lady Wisdom, in those long discourses, allegedly, and that's supposed to be another clue that they're not robustly historical, and I dealt with that last week. So what's the deal with the supposed long discourses? Well, two things I think come across to people and seem to be implied in those allusions. First of all, that the length is unusual in John, that there's something in John such that he has longer, apparent, uninterrupted discourses than the Synoptic Gospels do. And second, that length is unrealistic in some way. That there's something about that length that is so odd that we should question whether it was recognizably historical. If you'd really been there, would you have found Jesus saying things and be able to say, oh, okay, that's the bread of life discourse, if you understood the relevant language. And both of those implications are false. As far as the unrealism of the length, this is just kind of surprising to me. Jesus is paramount, a teacher and a preacher. I mean, even if you don't think he was God, even if you're not a Christian, who was Jesus? He was a teacher and a preacher. So what is strange at all historically about finding him teaching and preaching? And moreover, the length can be definitely exaggerated. And we can get a strange idea of this. So, for example, you can actually read the Sermon on the Mount that's in Matthew, which, as I'm going to mention in a moment, is the longest uninterrupted discourse in any gospel. without hurrying in approximately 15 minutes. depending on how fast you speak. I'm not talking about Ben Shapiro's speed here, okay? But approximately 15, 16 minutes. You could read the entirety of John 13 through 17, which, by the way, is not a single discourse. There's dialogue in there. He gets interrupted. They even get up and move and go toward the Garden of Gethsemane, and then there's a prayer included there. So I'm not acknowledging this as a single discourse. But even if you did read all of those chapters, you could read it in a leisurely fashion. I apparently tried this while I was writing The Eye of the Beholder. I didn't try it again in the last couple days, but at that time I timed it at about 25 minutes, even a little bit less. So obviously, Jesus would have been speaking for longer. We find in the feeding of the 5,000, he was with them all day. Now, during part of that time, I think he was moving around healing them. It even mentions that he healed. But I'm sure that Jesus spoke for longer at a time than 15 minutes. So we have a distorted view of how long the discourses in the Gospels are, and certainly how long the discourses in John are. The other thing is that this comparative statement is also false. This is another way in which this is a myth, the myth of the Johannine monologuing Jesus. In the 19th century, a Unitarian, they don't make Unitarians like they used to, so he's a heretic, but he did some good work here, named James Drummond, did some research on this and went and counted. And he came up with some really interesting stuff. So, for example, consider how many passages containing more than 10 verses of Jesus' uninterrupted speech, but less than 20 we have. We have 8 of those in Matthew and only 3 in John. And then passages containing more than 20 verses of Jesus' uninterrupted speech. We have 4 of those in Matthew and 3 in John. And then what's the prize? The longest is the Sermon on the Mount, which is 107 verses. And then second, uninterrupted, is 93 verses, is Matthew's Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. And the longest uninterrupted segment of speech by Jesus in John is a portion of the Farewell Discourse, which is 52 verses from John 14:23 to John 16:16. So, and that's not all on the same topic, but that includes like the true vine and in chapter 15 and things like that. But I'm just going by uninterrupted apparent speech on an occasion. And the prizes in several of these categories go to Matthew rather than to John. So there's just a confusion here. So why do scholars get this opposite impression? That John is characterized by long, long discourses where Jesus goes on and on at length for many verses. Richard Bauckham makes an interesting point in an article of his. I don't know if this article is still available for free. At one time it was, and if I find an online version, I'll post that link in the show notes, and if not, I'll at least post the reference to the paper version, because I think it may have been taken down online. But in this article, Bauckham says that actually the sermons in John, the discourses in John, appear more realistic than the discourses in the synoptics because they're not as choppy. He says, are we under the impression that Jesus speaks only in aphorisms? Now, something that Drummond pointed out is that you do have these pithy sayings in John. Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. I have meat to eat that you know not of. That which is born of the flesh is flesh. That which is born of the spirit is spirit. So many of our, most famous, even, before Abraham was, I am. Okay, I am the resurrection and the life. These very memorable short sayings you do find in John, but they tend to be embedded in more connected speech. Whereas if you contrast that with, say, a section of the Sermon on the Mount or a section of the Sermon on the Level Place in Luke, you find the synoptic discourses are more choppy. And Balcom says, something that's often overlooked is that Jesus couldn't have really spoken like this. A good speaker would have more connecting material between his sayings. This relates to the subject of Johannine idiom, and I will be doing some videos just on Johannine idiom, but I could not find a way to disentangle this notion of connectedness and what I call a looping, repetitive style within a single discourse in John from this discussion of length and this myth of the monologuing Jesus. So Balcom actually acknowledges that it looks more like a real discourse in John, more like what someone would really have said on a given occasion because it's more connected. Now, Balcom unfortunately takes away with his left hand what he gives with his right, or takes away with his right hand what he gives with his left, or however that goes. And I don't want to seem to be concealing that or taking Balcom out of context. He says that even though the Johannine style is more realistic, it would involve more putting words in Jesus' mouth, and I'm gonna challenge that. I'm gonna question that. But his main point is that both the choppiness in the synoptics and the connectedness in John are, he said, sort of solutions to the way of presenting Jesus' words. So I think what he's getting at is that in the synoptics, they aren't going to represent him as repeating himself often on a single occasion. They're kind of boiling it down a little bit more. It would be easier to remember that way. Whereas John is presenting it in this more connected fashion, which is actually more realistic. And he says these are both legitimate solutions to the problem of how to present, discourses in a manageable way. Unfortunately, he does say that would involve more putting words into Jesus' mouth. But I think it's interesting that Balcom's acknowledging that it actually looks more real in John. And so I ask the question then, if it looks more real in John, why do we think it's less real? What is that? And something that I try to do on this channel is to bring out unspoken premises. When I had my dialogue/debate with Dr. Craig Evans in 2018, I brought out Drummond's work to him, and I said it's not actually true that Jesus speaks for longer, uninterrupted in John. So I just challenged him directly with that, and I brought out some of these statistics that I gave a few minutes ago, and I owe these to Tim, by the way. He pointed me to Drummond's work, as he so often does. I'm often indebted to Tim for pointing me to these 19th century scholars like Stanley Leathes, Leathes, whom I used a few videos ago, and now James Drummond. So I pointed that out to Dr. Evans, and Dr. Evans' response was curious. He said, well, perhaps Lydia is unaware. He had this habit of constantly speaking of me in the third person in that. And I may have even fallen into doing it with him as well, even though our host, Justin Brierly, had expressly asked us ahead of time not to do that, to speak to each other directly. But Evans was pretty persistent in this. So, I wonder if Lydia is aware of the way that scholars think that these were composed. And, maybe she doesn't know about this, but scholars think that the discourses in Matthew were composites. Now, what a composite discourse is, and he didn't go on in any detail, but he kind of explained it. The idea is that these things weren't really all said at the time when Matthew presents them as being said, but they're kind of stitched together from historical sayings, but sayings that Jesus uttered at a wide variety of places and times. And that is a very widespread scholarly view. And I was, aware of it. I was not unaware of it, but I didn't see at the time And he did not explain why the alleged composite nature of the discourses in Matthew should be an argument against the robust historicity of the discourses in John. Now, at the time in the dialogue, I gave a response that I would probably modify now. I said, I'm completely open to composite discourses. Why are you not open to the possibility that John's discourses are composite? I mean, if being composite is somehow more historical, which puzzled me, why is that supposed to be more historical? But if it is, why not think of the possibility that some of John's discourses might be composite as well? He didn't answer that. And in fact, it turns out Ben Witterington thinks that the farewell discourse is composite. Now, I don't agree with him there, but he thinks that Jesus had several meals with his disciples in the same week, and utter different portions of this in those several meals. So there's even one scholar who does do that. Now, since then, I have read portions of D.A. Carson's commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, and Carson is pretty emphatic, and I found this was great. It kind of stiffened my spine. That when an author strongly presents a discourse as occurring at a given time, and he talks about bracketing in Matthew, that we should take that seriously. Matthew brackets even his longest discourse, the Sermon on the Mount, with, Jesus sat down and he began to speak, saying, and then at the end, and when he had completed these sayings. So it's he's saying it was at that time. And so Carson's in a minority here. Interestingly, Dr. Evans said, all critical scholars think the Matthew discourses are composite. Maybe Carson doesn't get that accolade of being a critical scholar. I think he was unaware of Carson's position. And I think Carson's right there. I think we need to take that seriously. Sometimes you get something that's clearly what I've dubbed achronological, and in this case where, just a bunch of sayings on a given topic are dumped together and there isn't any clear setting or time. I think Luke does that sometimes in his central section, and in what are just sort of, what I call sayings sections, and he doesn't bracket them or clearly tag them to a particular time. But Matthew does, and John does too. I even emphasized this last time, the very clear historicity of, say, the Bread of Life discourse. He said these things in the synagogue at Capernaum. So I would not concede as much as I did at that time to composite discourses in Matthew, and you can read my appendix on that topic in the Mirror or the Mask if you're interested in more. The question still remains, what is it about being composite that looks more historical? And what we have to do here is bring out some unstated premises. Often scholars will say things and they'll say them in an impressive way, and it takes you a moment to go, wait, what? Why does that support this? And you're just supposed to get sort of drawn in and go, oh, okay, Okay, so I think I finally teased out the premises, even though I couldn't find anybody actually stating the unstated premises. And I think the unstated argument goes something like this. If a discourse is composed of stitched together aphorisms or very short segments that Jesus didn't really utter all on a given occasion, it would be easy for the community of believers in the form of oral tradition to remember those short pieces without remembering their contexts, or maybe with remembering their different contexts, but to remember them because they're short. Then each individual piece could be historical, and somebody else could come along with a metaphorical needle and thread and stitch them together, these different historical bits, into something that looks longer uninterrupted, but was never really uttered at a given time uninterrupted, and presented as if it was uttered at a given time, like the Sermon on the Mount. And it's historical in the sense that all the different bits are historical, even though nobody could, allegedly, here's another unspoken premise, remember that these things were all uttered on that occasion. That would be too hard. Okay, so it's this sort of distributed memory thesis, that you're distributing the memory of different bits uttered at different times within the community, and then all that the one guy has to do is stitch them together. He doesn't have to actually have any source or sources that tell him that this was done on that occasion, on that given occasion, because that would be too hard. Okay, now what does it have to do with John? Well, we got more on, more premises, okay? John's discourses are much more unified. They move more seamlessly from one topic to another. They involve this sort of looping repetition. And so they really appear to have been uttered at one time more realistically. So that would require that a person actually remember that these topics, or even this topic, was addressed in this sort of continuous, unified manner on that occasion, and nobody could possibly remember that. So therefore, John must be what we might call boiling up his discourses, taking one thing and, it's like a souffle, it sort of rises, rather than boiling down by cutting stuff out, which the synoptics may be doing, or you might do in historical reportage, but instead he's elaborating. So there's your argument sort of laid out. Nobody could remember, and it really depends on this sort of brute length, nobody could remember thesis, and that's what's being taken to be unrealistic. Nobody could remember something that looks unified like this on a given occasion. So, since Matthew isn't trying to do something that looks unified, he could be reporting actual historical material gathered from a variety of sources. And I think that's really the unspoken argument. Well, how would I answer that argument? First of all, I want to acknowledge that unified style and that looping style for segments. That whole section from John 14:23 to John 16:16 is not on a single topic. But suppose we took, say, John 15, 1 through 15, and I print this out in the Eye of the Beholder, and I print a section of similar length from the Sermon on the Level Place, and I'm like, yeah, John takes the topic of, say, bearing fruit, and he links it into keeping Jesus' commandments, and he links it into, his Father wanting them to keep his commandments and this kind of thing. And then at the end, he kind of comes back to that topic of bearing fruit. And if you read it, you'll see that it's actually very powerful. And in that sense, very realistic to an excellent teacher, that this is how an excellent teacher could very well present that material. So I'm acknowledging that. Why do I not acknowledge the argument then that this needs to be puffed up like a souffle, or that this needs to be the result of elaboration? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the legitimate use of the concept of paraphrase. Now, if you watch my stuff, you know this is something I just hammer on. This abuse of the concept of paraphrase. It's used to say that, if you'd been there, you wouldn't have heard Jesus say, I am the door, I am the true vine, but the Johannine community took this and said, he is to us the true vine, and his teaching really means this theologically, and that's called paraphrase. In my dialogue with Dr. Evans, he said, I would ask, does Lydia believe in paraphrase? Lydia believes in paraphrase, but that ain't paraphrase. But there's a Latin phrase, which I won't try to quote in Latin. The abuse does not take away the use. So the abuse of something does not mean that there is no legitimate use of it. Okay? So the abuse of the concept of paraphrase, or even the word gist, which I hesitate to use because it has been so badly abused, doesn't mean that there's no legitimate use of it. Suppose that you had, let's put together that concept with a good memory. Suppose that you had a teacher who gets up on the first day and he delivers what I would call a look in the syllabus discourse. It's August now. We're coming up on the beginning of a new school year, and I imagine many of you who are professors will deliver a look in the syllabus discourse on your first day of class, because it gets so frustrating that you have students who will email you questions, raise their hands, ask you questions, and it's in the syllabus. It's in the syllabus, okay? I have a daughter who's going to be going to college for the first time this fall, and I'll be telling her, look in the syllabus, see if the answer to your question is there before you ask the prof. And let's suppose that there were a student who's good at imitation, he's got a good memory, and he's amusing his fellow students with an imitation of the certain professor's look in the syllabus discourse. He could very well remember pretty accurately, some verbatim, some somewhat different in wording, some summarized, but what that teacher said on that occasion. So when I talk about paraphrase, I'm talking about recognizable content in a recognizable context. Recognizable content on a recognizable occasion. So it's not like you're taking it and putting it into a different context, okay? But that he really, said that on that occasion. And that student could very well give you recognizably what the teacher said on that first day of class. But did the teacher say, look in the syllabus 6 times, or did he, on that occasion, or did he say it 4 times? Either way, if the student, in his little, in imitation speech gives it 4 times and it was 6 times, or gives it 6 times and it was 4 times, it's still recognizable content on a recognizable occasion. Okay? And I think you can see this with a distinction between Bible translations. So you have your pretty literal translations, like the King James, actually, for its the text family it was using is fairly literal. The old NASB from the 70s, pretty literal. The ESV, okay. And then you have the NIV, which is a little bit more paraphrased, but still very recognizable. Where if you read the Bread of Life discourse in the NIV, and you were transported back in time, and you understood the relevant language, I think you would recognize it. But then you have, imagine something like the Amplified Bible, where you take off all the square brackets, right? And maybe you add even more stuff. And really what it is just, or I think the message is even more like this. It's really not a translation at all. It's someone's thoughts that have been sparked by reading it. It's not just that it's in modern language, it's that it's a person, definitely elaborating in giving you his own thoughts, but putting them in Jesus' mouth, and as I say, taking off all the brackets so that there's no distinction made. I think we can regard the NIV, particularly not the TNIV, which has some agendas, but that older NIV, as a recognizable paraphrase. But some of these other things that are just basically, Bible studies being put into Jesus' mouth, they cross a line and they're not recognizable anymore. So I think if we have the proper understanding of paraphrase, coupled with the idea of an excellent memory. I think we can see how it would be very possible for you to have that recognizable, legitimate paraphrase of what Jesus said on a given occasion. I think John did have an excellent memory. I think we see this in other ways with the references to time in the Gospel of John, the references to distance and to specific archaeological things, or what we think of as archaeological things, places that have been discovered, specific details of quantities, like, how many gallons approximately, how big were the jars at the time of the marriage at Cana, and that kind of thing, that he had this mind for detail and a retentive memory, a retentive visual memory, I think, very strongly. And I think he had a retentive auditory memory as well. And I want to emphasize here, since I gave that Bible translation contrast, I am not actually saying that Synoptics are NASB and John is the NIV. I think they may both be in their own way NIVs. They may both be in their own ways an accurate, recognizable paraphrase, recognizable both as to content and context and occasion. And I'll be talking about that more in my further videos on Johannine idiom. It's important to remember that we don't have discourses in John that are also given, like that same discourse, in the Synoptics. A very important point. We don't have a synoptic version of the farewell discourse. And we don't have a synoptic version of the bread of life discourse, say, and then the John's version of the bread of life discourse, and we can lay them side by side and say, wow, these are really different. It's not like that at all. They're actually giving you different material, and I think that's important to remember. And another point is that I don't believe that John waited many decades in silence before telling people what Jesus said in these discourses. The date of John may be, and I think plausibly was, because this is what the early church fathers seemed to think, was something that John had written down. He may have had a secretary. I don't think that secretary was a co-author and changing facts and stuff like that, but he may have narrated it to a secretary in his old age. But that doesn't mean that prior to his old age he was sitting there with his mouth closed. We hear a lot about oral tradition, and oral tradition will sometimes be used to defend the memory of the community, that if something was being remembered and recited repeatedly within a community, then they had a way of remembering it. What I don't think we hear enough about is the way that preaching on something, telling a story, fixes it in your own mind. I find this to be true. If I come home after something funny happened to me at the store and I tell the story over supper, that helps to fix in my mind what this person said and that person said. And the more times I tell it, the more I review it for myself. So I think John would have been reviewing this very, very shortly after Jesus died, rose again, and went to heaven. That John would have been telling these things to others from the beginning. And so therefore that fixes it in his own mind, even if it isn't written down until decades later. So put together those things. Good memory, tells the things from early on, reviews them in his mind and reviews them for others from early on, and legitimate, recognizable paraphrase, that it's not absolutely verbatim. And I think we have a good account of how it's not at all impossible for these things to have been recognizably historical. We need to learn to put these kinds of things together. And by the way, in recognizably historical things, there are going to be portions that are going to be verbatim. My online friend Steve, to whom I dedicated The Eye of the Beholder because he had recently passed away, he made a very good point that the shorter a saying is, the more likely it is that, it's hard to get away from it as far as, what does it mean for I am the true vine not to be uttered verbatim? Well, it might mean that Jesus went on longer about before Abraham was I am, for example, but that's not usually what those people mean. If someone says, oh, before Abraham was I am, wasn't recorded verbatim, they don't mean that Jesus even more emphatically said, before Abraham was I am, for I existed before all things, and John gave just a part of it. So I think there are segments that are translated, maybe Jesus was speaking Aramaic and then translated into Greek, for example. We don't know for certain what language Jesus was speaking on these occasions. Scholars differ over that, but with allowance for that, very close to verbatim, but that the discourse as a whole is going to include some sections that are a little more paraphrased or summarized, and of course shorter than it probably really originally was. Memory tends to select material, and yet nonetheless, if you'd been there on the night in which Jesus was betrayed, you could say, oh, this is the true vine section. This is where he says this. So cool to hear this for myself, if you could get in the TARDIS and go back and hear it. So I want to give you these tools to defend the historicity of the Johannine discourses and against this myth of the monologuing Jesus, that Jesus looked like he was speaking for way longer in the Gospel of John than in the Synoptics, and that it's unrealistic and unbelievable. Sometimes I have people write to me, I've had this happen on more than one occasion, and say to me, I'm not an expert. How can I possibly challenge experts in biblical studies? And there are two really important points here. First of all, if you follow an expert, there's doubtless going to be some other expert who disagrees with him. So even in order to make a non-arbitrary choice of which expert to follow, you need to do something other than just picking the first expert you hear. And I think you should also do something other than just following what you're told is the consensus. And then, second of all, biblical studies does not involve quantum theoretic mathematics. Don't let anybody tell you that there's some kind of, mystery religion here, like the Gnostic mysteries, that you have to be initiated into. I'll be talking about this more in further videos about Greek, the Greek language. You can look at the arguments. The answer is look at the arguments and evaluate them. Dig down enough to see what the arguments are. And that's something I'm doing for you. I'm giving you a hand up. I'm giving you a step up in doing this by saying, well, these are the arguments, So when I did my series on the temple cleansing, I said, these are the arguments that are used that John moved the temple cleansing. And in this series, I'm giving you, these are the arguments that are used that John is substantially elaborating or inventing what Jesus said, including even trying to bring out unspoken premises like I did here. I'm doing that for you so you don't say, well, what am I to do? I can't disagree with an expert. Well, look at the argument, and then yes, you can disagree with the expert. And that's something you're only going to find here on the Lydia McGrew channel. So thanks for watching this. Thanks for subscribing to this channel where we're making common sense rigorous.